successful. And is there anybody who's joined who I have not checked in that would like to check in real quick before I disappear?
Maybe just make sure that you can hear me.
Oh, hello, Ms. Chappelle. How are you today?
Good morning. I'm great. Thanks very much.
Wonderful. I can hear you and see you. Thank you so much
Fantastic.
for checking in with me. I appreciate that.
Thank you. You bet. Thank you very much.
All righty. So Chair, are you good to go then with your recording?
I'm good. And we are
Alrighty.
recording and we will begin.
You are wonderful. Thank you, madam.
All right, thank you. Welcome, everybody. This is the noticed public meeting of the Child Support Guidelines Committee for February 18th, 2022. It is now just past 9 o'clock. It's 9:04. The meeting was noticed for 9 a.m. We are happily back with the legislature on Zoom, where I believe technology will go a little bit smoother today. So I'm going to go ahead and do a roll call. Ms. Baker.
Present.
Ms. Chappell.
Present.
Am I saying it wrong? I know you're here.
It's Chapel. That's okay. Everybody makes the, pronounces it their own way.
When she said Chappelle, I thought, oh no, I've been doing it wrong. All right, Ms. Cliff.
Present.
And Assemblywoman Cohen is excused. Ms. Crecilius.
I'm here.
Mr. Fleeman.
Present.
No, you're here, but I couldn't hear
Here.
you. Okay. Assemblywoman Hardy. Senator Harris. Judge Hoskin.
Here.
Senator Pickard.
I'm here.
Judge Robb. Present. Mr. Stanford.
Present.
Judge Shirley. Justice Stiglitz.
Present.
And myself. We have a quorum. All right. We are going to move on to agenda item number 2, which is public comment. Those of you giving public comment today, your public comment will be limited to 2 minutes per person. I am very strict on this. If you are here on behalf of AAML, please note that you have been placed on the agenda to actually speak with the committee freely on each of the AML items on the agenda. So you don't necessarily need to give public comment during this part of the presentation, but you are welcome to. Ms. Tomlinson, can we take public comment now? Ms. Tomlinson, are you available?
Sorry, I didn't
That's
have
okay.
my mic unmuted.
No worries.
To give public comment, please raise your hand in the Zoom meeting or press *9 on your phone to take your place in the queue. I'm showing no hands are raised at this time.
All right, thank you. We will have public comment again at the end of the meeting if anybody desires to be present. Also, in addition to the roll call, I should just note there are members of DWSS staff that are assisting us and are on roll call. I also do believe that we have a deputy AG here on behalf of our regular deputy AG in case we have questions or anybody needs anything. Ms. Benson, that was you that appeared for 2 seconds. So we are going to move on to agenda item number 3, approval of meeting minutes. Let's begin with the October 15th, 2021 meeting minutes. Do I have a motion?
Madam Chair, could I
Yes.
make a slight correction, and it will be a correction that will follow through with all the minutes?
Yes. Do you want to do it after when we have a motion and a second and then do comments?
Certainly, and I can make the motion.
Let's do that. Go ahead and make the motion.
So move.
All right. Do I have a second?
I'll second. Justice Stiglitz.
Justice Stiglitz is the second. All right. Any further discussion on it? Judge Robb?
Yes, Madam Chair, Bridget Robb for the record. I am no longer the presiding judge of the Second Judicial. I don't want to take that title. So if that correction could be made, I would appreciate it.
Yes, and I was going to make that correction also. You were when you were appointed to this committee, and I think it's stayed with you for the duration.
It has,
And-
it has
Judge
with the current
Hoskin.
presiding's approval.
Yes.
Yeah, and the way I've noticed that in the past, and I just left it because it's on behest of the presiding judge that we're still doing it, like the state bar has the members. So certainly I don't want to take that title either. I don't want that position back. So if it needs to be changed, I'm okay with it being changed as well.
As much as we would like you to take it back.
No problem. And with clarification, yes, that is how your positions are appointed. Same with mine, with Family Law Executive Council, which I don't sit on anymore, but I was appointed by the Family Law Executive Council and I represent them. So, okay. We have a motion and a second. All in favor of approving the October 15th, 2021 minutes, state aye.
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 Opposed, state nay. Any abstentions? Motion passes. Do I have a motion for the November 19th, 2021 minutes?
Move to approve.
Motion by Judge Rob, second by
Second.
Joseph Sanford. Any further discussion? All in favor, state aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Motion passes. And December 10th, 2021 meeting minutes.
This is Judge Rob for the record. Move to approve.
Okay,
Second.
second by Joseph Sanford. I was looking right at Joseph. You can't tell on my computer screen, but any further discussion? All in favor, state aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Motion passes. January 7th, 2022 meeting minutes.
Motion to approve those minutes, Kathleen Baker.
Kathleen Baker, do we have a second?
Second.
Joseph Sanford, second. Any further discussion?
Yes, Madam Chair, a brief change in agenda item number 7. When it's talking about what I said, it says GAP. That should be capital G, capital A, capital A, capital P, the acronym for generally accepted accounting practices, not merely GAAP, GAP. I think that's an important distinction. That's why I wanted to make it.
Okay, so noted. And, oh shoot, Ms. Baker was the motion on this. Do you accept that as an edit?
I
with your
do.
Motion, okay. And the second, Joseph Sanford, do you accept that?
Yes.
Okay, any further discussion on these minutes? Okay, hearing none. The motion is to pass the January 7th, 2022 minutes with the edit from Judge Rob. All in favor, state aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Motion passes. All right. Moving along to agenda item number 4. This item is discussion and recommendations on the master document for approved language changes. And I have included that as exhibit 1. For what was sent by email just now, it was done so in a PDF. Again, if anybody needs the Word document, I'm just trying to track what's going on in the committee. Any thoughts or concerns about that document right now pursuant to what has happened so far? Okay, hearing none. I don't think it needs an approval or a motion. It's just a document trying to track our progress the best we can. All right, so we will move on to agenda item number 5. Which is discussion and recommendations on whether income from bonuses should be included in gross income and how the receipt of a bonus impacts child support, and in particular, the language in NAC 425.025 subsection 1. Exhibit 2 are the new edits from Senator Pickard. And Senator Pickard, do you want to take the lead on this now?
Sure. What we discussed over the past couple of meetings was how do we pick up the missing bonuses from the language, given that we're starting to see some differentiations, some distinctions made. The intent of the original rule was to include all sources of income that were consistent and substantial. And so, as the committee is aware, we've kind of gone through different iterations. The last discussion was about rather than having two almost identical paragraphs, to combine them. And so that's what this final language does. It just goes through that monetary compensation incident to employment includes salary, wages, commissions, bonuses, and overtime compensation that is substantial, consistent, and can be accurately determined. I think that the participation and the collaboration on this has made it something we all can agree on, but we wanted to wait till this meeting until everybody had a chance to review it and digest it. And so unless someone has some additional input, I'm prepared to make a motion to adopt it.
Okay, motion to adopt. We will have discussion on it, but do we have a second?
Second, Judge Rob.
Judge Rob, second. All right, and any further discussion? All right, hearing none. We will move on to a vote. All in favor, state aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? All right, motion passes. I will incorporate that language into the master document. Good job, Senator Pickard. I'm thrilled with this language. I like that we came up with monetary compensation part. All right, so we are moving on to agenda item number 6. Discussion and recommendations on NAC 425.025 subsection 1K1 and the calculation of reasonable allowance for economic depression or depreciation, not depression. Hello. Exhibit 3. We left this on the agenda last time. It was from our public comment from Ms. Woods. And is anybody prepared today to further discuss this, or is it an item you want to continue to hold on the agenda for further discussion later? Hearing nothing.
We remember who it was. This is Keith Pickard for the record. Do we remember who it was? Because I know I've talked about this. We had some public comment on it. I just don't remember who first, and it may have been me. I just don't remember who first promoted this.
Ms. Woods, it was from public comment.
Okay.
It
Well,
was combined with 2 other items, and we removed the other 2 items from the agenda.
All right. I really like the idea of making the distinction. I think that, I've struggled with depreciation because it's an accounting mechanism and not necessarily a real life treatment of expenses. I understand the benefit for doing it this way because then you're spreading that expense over a longer period of time. But the reality is the expense is incurred all at once. But when we're talking about the reasonable allowance for economic depreciation, we didn't really consider GAAP. We didn't really consider the tax method, the accelerated depreciation that's allowed under the tax code. So I think that it's something we should address. I'm not taking a particular position on it, but I do think that and I've experienced this in my cases, it's an avenue for for difficulty for people to try to go in and lower their child support. But I do think it's important to make sure that number one, we're not double counting income, and undistributed income isn't going to be if we're talking about normal accounting, and I think this would fall under GAAP. This part, undistributed income is income that's retained by the business. We have that in my firm, and most businesses do if they're owners are being paid a salary. And for various tax and accounting reasons, they want to do that. So if you're getting a salary, that's distributed income. If you're retaining income in the business, it's still your income if you own it. And so they are, by definition, different things. Now, there may be a way that that's double counted I'm not familiar with, but to the extent that we want to make sure we capture the undistributed income within someone's business, particularly if we're talking about a sole proprietorship or a single member LLC, then I think that we really do need to address this.
How would one go about valuation of a business? Margot Chapel for the record.
Well, businesses are typically valued by business appraisers or valuation experts. And there's a half dozen or so of them here in Southern Nevada and more around the state. And so what they do is they typically look at the 3 standard methods of appraisal. And the rules are a little different. And in fact, there are different bodies that have different sets of rules, although they are almost identical. But then they appraise the business, usually based on a combination of income, assets, and investment approaches. And so they can estimate what a value or what a business should be worth were it sold, because we're always looking for market value.
Margot Chapel for the record. So this would be a process the court would require then that the business be valuated for counting of undistributed income in a certain case?
Well, the business valuation itself, it will look at cash on hand as part of the asset approach, but this doesn't really deal directly with business valuation per se. This is about what do we use for calculating income for purposes of child support. And undistributed income is income which won't show up on a paycheck or a W-2, but is retained by the business. And so if someone, and we usually, the first red flag, and I don't want to be the one necessarily answering all these questions, but if someone is getting, say they own a business, we look at the profit and loss statement from the business and they're making $1 million, but their income is only reflected at, $30,000 or $40,000. And it's a service business where they are most of the expense. Those things are red flags. So we know, okay, let's get into the details and see if there's undistributed income retained by the business, because that's ultimately business or income that they should be reporting. And so those are the kinds of things that this is addressing. There may be other things that are contributing to undistributed income. Sometimes there are tax withholding that is held in a separate account for future payment that some want to treat as undistributed income, where it's not. It's actually a holding account for purposes of tax. So we've gone back and forth on these things in the past, and this is a way of just stating that undistributed income of a business is subject to use in a child support calculation.
So I shared my screen just to show the original email from Kimberly Woods, who is tax manager with Reuben Brown, who sent the original email question, and it was number 3. We eliminated these 2 items from our agenda and resolved them, but we decided to leave this 3rd item on the agenda.
Wouldn't that be the second, the undistributed income, or did we delete that?
We resolved that.
Okay.
So this is the
Sorry.
item that we
I'm
left
talking
on.
about the wrong thing. Why didn't somebody tell me to shut up?
This is
You
reasonable.
did,
allowance
you were
for-
just, we were all muted when we were telling you
Oh,
to shut up.
yeah.
I just wanted to get us back to, I was trying to bring this.
Yeah,
back in.
sorry.
It's okay. So economic depreciation was the agenda item, and her comment was that our statute, the NAC that we passed, stated that well, it defines the reasonable allowance for economic depreciation to mean depreciation on assets computed using straight line method and useful lives as determined under federal income tax laws and regulation. There is confusion as to whether the determination of which assets are depreciable should be made using federal income tax laws, or whether another standard such as GAAP should be used. Now that I'm looking at this, we did resolve the GAAP issue, didn't we?
Yeah, we talked about, I think it was Judge Rob, maybe I should let.
We weren't willing to use that. Now that I look at the rest of this, yeah.
Yeah.
I kept the exact item number from the minutes, but we may have had confusion on the record about her email and which one we were discussing.
Well, can I ask if there's any appetite to deleting the depreciation language from the regulation entirely?
Comments from the committee?
Does anybody recall where we got this language? Did we take this from somewhere else? I don't think we created this from whole cloth.
I'd have to go back. I remember having the discussion, and I remember someone advocating for depreciation because it is an expense to the company. Rather than allow someone, say I were to replace my rooftop units for $50,000, that would reduce my actual business income by $50,000 in 1 year, but we didn't want to necessarily take that total hit and base a 3-year child support amount on that. That's my recollection, but I'm pretty fuzzy on that.
Yeah. I don't remember where we got it from. This is the section here in yellow.
This is Joseph for the record. I think there's a lot to be going on here. Just something I did notice, amongst other things that we're doing, it may make sense to actually swap number 2 and number 1, because it says, define reasonable allowance for economic depreciation first, but the reasonable allowance for economic depreciation doesn't actually get stated until number 2, where you go to the undistributed income. And so I'm not sure if the intention was to actually have reasonable allowances for economic depreciation, maybe somewhere else, maybe it's somewhere else in the paragraph, but I haven't seen it. It's only under undistributed income. And that actually seems somewhat strange to me all around. I think it was intended probably to just be maybe under K altogether, but I thought it was confusing as to whether it only really applies to undistributed income or whether it applies to the business as a whole. So that was just something to note. I do think just my recollection is similar to everyone else, that this was brought in on the idea that this is the method that is generally used for big purchases over time in like the tax code and things, so that there's less gamesmanship in how child support is going to be determined, instead of having folks say, oh, well, I have a child support hearing, I'm going to go out and make my big purchases, and then say I didn't make any money this year. Or
they just leave it in the business and then claim they don't have income, right? Yeah.
I mean, I've had cases, child's 14, 15 years old, and they'll say, hey, I know I can show no income for the next 4 years because I can do that, and then have everything set up for when they're not. And so I think that was the idea. I'm not sure where we got this language from exactly, but it looks like maybe if we did copy it, maybe we didn't copy the whole thing, because it looks like there should have been the reasonable allowance for economic depreciation in a previous paragraph that maybe we just didn't copy.
Well, I would love to hear from the judges to see if they see this at all, but I agree. My recollection is these are ways of managing how we calculated the undistributed income, which is probably how I got on that tangent anyway. But it was, as we're looking at undistributed income, how do we calculate that? And the businesses typically will take their expenses and their depreciation to offset that.
And just as far as I've never utilized this for child support. It's never been presented in that fashion to have me calculate gross income on child support based upon that. The argument is there, but nobody's ever tried to go through and analyze the depreciation side of it, at least that I.
It's a lot to go through for child support, quite honestly, but I mean, if you're in just a custody case, of course, I mean, that would be excruciating to go through, but if somebody's hiding their income, that's the bigger part, right? I don't know if it's about the calculation as much as you got hundreds of thousands of dollars sitting in your business that you're not doing shareholder distributions or payroll on yourself and pretending like you don't have any money. That's all we're trying to get around. I don't know if we're trying to really get to an exact amount as much as get to the truth of what's going on and that there is more income there. And at that point, the court can impute it, right? If you don't actually do real numbers on undistributed income.
Right.
This is Judge Rob. I've had this come up just a couple of times, and it's exactly what Ms. Surratt was stating. Somebody was basically squirreling all of their money in the company, saying they needed to retain that so that they could make, different purchases and advancements in the company, while at the same time, no income to them at all for child support purposes. And so it was something we did have to look at, but it isn't common.
I almost would say, I know that the email we received from Ms. Woods was trying to get to a very fine line. This is the exact way you calculate it. I almost feel like the two definitions we have under K could be deleted and just simply saying, we're also going to look at undistributed income. Let the court, again, back to that kind of imputed income kind of an argument, which is you have money in there. We've got to figure out a way to use it. But maybe that's too simplistic.
I think though, and again, this is Bridget Robb for the record, I think we were trying to strike a balance, if I recall correctly, because a business should be able to deduct its reasonable business expenses before anything is declared to be income. And I think we were looking at, okay, what is a reasonable business expense as opposed to the small businesses where they run all their personal expenses through the business. And I think this was part of trying to strike that balance, if I recall correctly.
Well, a business has the right to hold some income for emergencies and not utilize it and not say it's part of child support because it needs to stay in the business for the benefit of the business.
Precisely so. Some retention of those earnings is something that would be appropriate.
Yeah, and I think if I recall correctly, Ms. Wood's concern was, how are we treating that? I thought that, we say it outright. It's in the black letter law. It's the straight line method. It's not GAAP. It's not the accelerated depreciation that the tax code allows. I had a case just a few months ago where a person was deleting their vacuum cleaner, their coffee maker, their car, all these things as business expenses. They were a sole proprietor and they worked from home. And the judge rightly said, no, those are personal expenses and disallowed them, even though she pointed to this as well. It's, depreciation of assets that are owned by the business. Well, ultimately, the IRS may let you get away with that, but we're not letting you deduct that from your child support. And so, but honestly, I don't know that we need to delete the two paragraphs. I wouldn't oppose it if that was the pleasure of the committee, but I don't think we need to make any changes ultimately.
Additional comments?
This is Bridget Robb. I agree with Mr. Pickard. or Senator Pickard, I apologize, sir. I'm not sure we need to do anything with this. Some of the questions, I think the text of the rule actually answered the question, so I'm not quite sure why there are issues.
Okay, is there anything in this email that I screwed up and was supposed to stay on the agenda that didn't? That's in these other two items? Everybody, please take a look. And maybe in my mass attempt with the AML materials, the agenda was a struggle. So I will heavily rely on the committee to kind of take a good look and see if next agenda I need to include any of these items back on. All right, if you had a chance to read, give me a thumbs up or something so I know what I'm looking at here. Okay. Any further motions or comments? Anything else we need to do with this before we move on?
Kim, it's Lydia Stiglitz. I think can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, I think I was just talking on mute. Somebody had mentioned about flipping 1 and 2. I do think we should do that. I don't know if we settled on it, just the definitions, just because the way they flow.
Yeah, I think I agree also because number 2 talks about the reasonable allowance for economic depreciation and then, but we had defined it before it. So,
right.
Do we have a motion for that?
So moved. This is Bridget Robb.
Judge
Second.
Robb. Second from Justice Stiglitz, is that?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Any further discussion?
Can you please clarify what the motion was?
Yes, the motion will be to take, let me get back up to the section numbers. NAC 425.025K and swap the subsections of 1 and 2, making 2 actually number 1 and 1 as number 2.
Thank you.
So that the definition of undistributed income comes before the definition of reasonable allowance for economic depreciation. Judge Robb, do I have that motion correct?
You do, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you both. I have no more questions.
Okay. All in favor, state aye.
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 Nays? Abstentions? Motion passes. Okay. Stop sharing for a moment. All right. That is the end of agenda item number 6. We're moving on to agenda item number 7.
Excuse me, Madam Chair, are we supposed to be taking public comment after each of these?
We did not. Oh, yes, we did. Sorry, you are correct. Let's go back. Gosh dang it. When we started dividing this up, my brain doesn't go there. I had too many meetings the other way. Let's do real quick. Do we have any public comment on agenda item number 5 regarding the language in the definition for gross income?
To give public comment, please raise your hand in the Zoom meeting or press star 9 on your phone to take your place in the queue. I'm showing no hands are raised at this time.
Okay, thank you. Can we now take public comment on agenda item number 6?
To give public comment, please raise your hand in the Zoom meeting or press star 9 on your phone to take your place in the queue. And I'm showing no hands are raised.
Okay, thank you. You will give me just a moment, please. All right, we are moving on to agenda item number 7, and this is the beginning of the series of items for the AAML, and I see that Mr. Willick has joined us. Mr. Willick, what we have done for the next however many agenda items is we have added you for discussion purposes as a presenter to each agenda item, so you can have discussion with us as called upon without having to wait for public comment, without being limited. So we are on agenda item number 7, which is discussion and recommendations on AAML recommended changes to NAC 425.100. And would the committee like me to put it on the screen while we
Yes,
are
please.
discussing it? Okay,
Mrs. Karen, yes, please.
all right. I am getting there. Hold on just a moment. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so this is their edits and changes to 425.100. Mr. Wilk, I think the committee's just looking for kind of a little more real life explanation for each section from you. The breakdown of each section with its edits before discussing the reorganization, in my opinion, is incredibly helpful and gives us some insight. And then the committee can discuss it and they can ask you questions if you don't mind.
Certainly. May I back up for a moment and explain what I would hope that the members of the committee can look at in trying to understand what it is we're attempting to accomplish. There are 3 documents that have been provided that I think all members of the committee have. One is the memorandum of November 29, 2021, which explains what we were attempting to accomplish. The other is the notes from the verbal presentation on December 10. And the third is a summary of proposed reordering, which was provided, which shows the 6 provisions to which no changes were requested, 1 new provision, and 1 typo, but I see that from what was on screen previously was approved January 7th, so that's no longer relevant.
Yes, and just so you know, your reorganization is also on the agenda as a separate agenda item. And the committee did have the other documents that you referenced.
Yeah, and it might be helpful if when we're referring to documents, if we can refer to them by our exhibit numbers so that we can be clear which ones we're looking at. But that's just a suggestion.
Okay, the reorganization documents will be our exhibits 12 and 13. It's also on agenda item number 15. So we will get to that when we get to that agenda item. The other document was given to the committee in a prior meeting, but we're just in, Mr. Willick, there has been discussion, which is the reason it's still on the agenda and broken down in pieces that we, that is worthwhile to discuss the edits and go through it with you in detail. And the edits that you were discussing, that there was one other, the typos, those were approved in the last meeting and were already incorporated into our master document changes to move forward through this committee.
Very good. Basically, most of what you're going to see here is going to be the detail of how to bring into effect the matters in the November 29 memo. To briefly re-summarize, there's structural reordering, terminology, and then amendment of specific problematic wording. Most of what you're looking at is terminology changes. There have been problems in the real world of district courts not perceiving whether the schedule is different from the guidelines as a document. So one of the things that we're recommending is clarity of language in each reference. When the intended reference is to the guideline schedule amount calculated per the formula that has been set up, that should be probably referred to as guideline schedule. When the guidelines as a regulatory document are being referred to, the word guidelines should be used. And I know that may seem silly, but it has led in the real world to problems in district court decisions as judges confuse those two concepts. When they're trying to decide whether to apply discretion to applying the guidelines, as opposed to using discretion to adjust the amount of support as calculated by the guideline schedule. And I hope that distinction makes sense, and I won't further belabor it in discussing it every place those words appear. If there's any questions, I'll answer it, but I would hope that that would be clear enough to move on. There was a question whether imputed income was part of the guideline schedule or not. And that's what you see in subsection 1, indicating that that is part of the calculation, not some add-on afterward. Once imputed income has been determined, the guideline schedule is applied to that income. 2 has to do with a problem that has appeared in some cases that have been reported to various AAML members. It was part of Sean Metter's original underlying memo. Oh, and by the way, I should probably back up and apologize. Mr. Metter had some sort of an emergency and was not able to attend today. Ditto Ms. Abrams. So I'm sorry you're stuck with me. But I will try to fill in for everybody. Number 2 came from the absence of a statement of purpose. And if I can explain what has happened in real world district courts, I'll try to be clear. Some judges have opined that the regulatory structure in the NAC is only designed to meet the basic needs of a child, and it's up to the judge to determine appropriate child support outside the guidelines. The problem is that basic needs is not defined, base child support is not defined, and the purpose of the regulations, whether to come up with a total child support amount or only a base child support amount, is not defined. This is a political decision for this committee, but I will report to the committee that it has a real world problem. Eventually, if it is not addressed in the regulatory structure, we believe that the matter will end up in the appellate courts, and the courts will make a determination of whether the guidelines are a mechanism for achieving a base amount that a judge then has discretion to alter, or is intended to create an entire child support award. And I believe this body should make that decision one way or another, and probably include some language. This is a suggestion from Mr. Metter for that language. If this committee makes a political decision that that is not the intended outcome of the regulations, then obviously change it to conform to what you believe the purpose is.
Marshall, can I ask you a question on that point?
Yes, sir.
When you're talking about the potential for a decision on the distinction, I just want to make sure I understand. Are you saying that there's an approach that would suggest that we're either meeting the basic needs of the child and that becomes a base, and then we adjust, we use other adjustment factors from there, or we have those adjustment factors as part of the calculation? I'm not sure I understand the distinction you're trying to make.
Some judges have opined that the entire regulatory structure as set out in the NAC is only intended to either create a base child support amount or address the basic needs of a child, and that it is up to a district court judge in, say, a high income situation where you have a wealthy obligor to use judicial discretion unbridled to adjust support upward because there is capacity to pay additional support. Did that answer your question, or have I missed your point?
Yeah, I think it does. And you know, that's a question that we hear a lot, particularly in the high income realm. Explain then how this fixes that.
Well, again, I wish Mr. Metter was here because it's his language, but his guess was that a child support order is intended to meet the basic needs of a child. Again, that's a political decision. And if the decision of this committee is that the guidelines as a whole, the guidelines, not the guideline schedule, but and the difference is the guideline schedule is a calculation. The guidelines include adjustments for various factors. If this committee decides that the guidelines are intended to complete a child support order, then language should probably be added to the regulations indicating that the regulations are intended to create an entire child support award, not a base child support award from which a judge then applies discretion.
All right. That makes sense. And I think that in at least in the last iteration, when we were looking at the studies and the discussions that were had, in my mind, it was more that we're going, the basic needs is the minimum standard, right? That, for example, when we're stipulating to an amount that doesn't follow the calculation of the guidelines, we have to stipulate that it meets the basic needs of the child. And that's because typically those stipulations are for no child support or significantly reduced child support. So at least they're meeting the basic needs of the child. But I don't think I like the idea of saying the only thing that child support is to do is to meet the basic needs, and then the high income earners don't have to contribute beyond that. And I think that's what this language does, which is why I was hesitant to adopt it.
Again, it was a suggestion, and it wasn't me making the suggestion, so I'm hesitant to say much about the mental process behind it.
Sure.
But again, it's a political decision of what this committee believes the purpose of the guidelines as a whole are. And if you believe that the adjustment factors are sufficient to meet an entire child support order, not create a base from which a judge should apply discretion to change a child support order, then you should probably say that.
I get it. And I think I would rather leave the discretion in the court. And then if the appellate courts think that we've given the courts too much discretion, we can let them weigh in and we can address that later. But that's my personal opinion.
Okay, are there other committee questions for Mr. Willick before we go into committee discussion? Okay, hearing none. Mr. Wilk, just hold in there because I'm sure we'll have more questions maybe at some point. Discussion on these edits to NAC 425.100, which is Exhibit 4, and I have it on the screen. I don't know. Oh, there is a little bit not showing. I'll bring that up just for a second. Although I have no idea how you guys are seeing it, but on my screen. All right, further discussion? Why don't I start us off, or go ahead.
This is Joe Sanford for the record. I'll just start with, I had been asked at the last meeting to maybe come up with alternative language to the word schedule and guideline piece. I think that was something that was confusing for a number of reasons. As Mr. Willick had sort of expressed, there's, I think, a difference between the guidelines referring to NAC 425, essentially 100 and on as a whole, and then the schedule under which I think is actually really just meaning NAC 425, 140 specifically. In trying to do that, I actually came across, I think, I guess, an issue with how our NAC ended up being put together, where I think, I don't know that we want to change it, but it is a fairly confusing ordering in terms of how the calculation is done and what the intention is in terms of, determining the final amount, specifically because, say, child custody and medical support is actually before we determine like the base amount. But that being said, sort of, I guess, going to that point, there is no current provision, or at least I'm not aware of one, that sort of has, I guess, the the final calculation language in there. And I think that's what leads to this kind of nuance between the guideline and the guideline schedule. I put some language together, but it's not perfect yet, so I didn't want to change it. But I think if the committee has an appetite, instead of having more like this statement of guideline schedule versus guidelines, I think maybe we'd be more looking at adding an additional section that is just to say something along the lines of a total child support obligation is calculated as the sum of, and it would be say the base child support obligation that we've already defined in 140 or 145 if you're using the low income payers table, child care pursuant to 130, medical support pursuant to 135, and then any deviations pursuant to 150. And so I think if we end up doing, instead of maybe doing quite the language that you see here, I think if we end up doing something more like that section, it ended up making it a lot easier to say the calculation in section, whatever we end up naming that, when we are trying to refer to the calculation. And then the guidelines can actually stay as guidelines because it's meant to be, I think, referring to NAC 425 as a whole. And so that I just wanted to kind of put that out since I know we started here. And it was quite a bit more, I think, than what was originally what I had talked about. And so it'd probably be something that I wanted to get some feedback from committee on before we did final language. But that would be my sort of suggestion instead of moving towards keeping the word guideline actually at all in our piece, because it was very confusing as to whether that is meant to mean the chapter as a whole or a specific section of 425. And I think it helps sort of address what was brought up here by Mr. Willick in terms of, is this supposed to be a total calculation or a base calculation?
I agree. I like that. I like referencing specific statutes or sections in particular. I would say, my scare factor was I went back to the actual bill jacket, the actual bill itself that was passed, and the edits to the NRSs, which of course utilize the word guidelines, and federal regs utilize the term guidelines. And so we know that what they're looking at when they audit us is they're looking at the entire chapter as the guidelines to audit to determine if we are in compliance with the federal rules or not. So I think when we were drafting we have to remember a lot of edits were made by LCB too. When it actually got formulated, language choices weren't always our choices from our initial documents. So what actually went through LCB didn't necessarily match up what we had done work product wise. Because what we had when we did our work product was step 1, do this, step 2, do this. And of course, you can't drop that into actual administrative codes. And that's where we lost a lot of our flow of the statutes in our eyes as to what the guidelines were. So I agree, Mr. Sanford. I think it's better than trying to mess around with this guideline schedule language proposed by Aaml, in my opinion, to actually do the organization that you were talking about and do a new definition of total child support is, and reference sections versus getting too deep into further language choices. But additional committee comments?
Madam Chair, Keith Pickard for the record. I agree wholeheartedly with what the two of you have said. The one thing I will say, though, is their suggestion about changing from deviation to adjustments, I think is well placed. We tried to do that in the last iteration, and somehow this one made it through. So I would suggest that become part of the adjustments that we make to the regs as we change deviation to adjustments. But to Marshall's point, I think that the distinction regarding the basic needs, whether that becomes a base or that is just the sum total of the guidelines, is an important one to be aware of. I just want to make sure that we know what, we're all in agreement to what we end up doing. Because I don't believe, based on my experience with the committee, that the intent was ever to create a limitation on child support, but instead that it's the whole thing. It's not just an object of meeting the basic needs and we're done.
I think some of this language came from, again, from the federal regs on the basic needs of a child. We were under a duty and an obligation to assure that child support was, at least in the economic sense of looking at the poverty levels and everything else, that we were meeting the basic needs of a child. And that presumed language, that it's presumed it meets the basic needs of a child, is very standardized language that is all through the federal regs. It is through multiple other states' language, because it is a duty that we have to attempt to get our child support to meet that. Now, we've always said, even in the prior statutes, that language was utilized, because we always, in our spiel to clients, it was, yeah, we say this meets the basic needs of a child, but we all know children are expensive, right? Child support rarely actually meets the needs of most children, but children who have special needs weren't supposed to be excluded as a reason for child support to go up. Children that have greater needs than the basic needs of a regular child, right, in society. I don't know if I agree with you, Senator Pickard, that the purpose of this committee, or the purpose of the changes we made, were for child support to be ongoing, unlimitless, except for, the 2% on the income increases. That is somewhat limitless. And it goes up, and it was going to go up way beyond the presumptions we had, the presumptive maximums we had in the old statutes. But I guess I know what the beef is here. You got an extremely, extremely rich client, and the judge is tacking on an extremely high child support amount. Do we have a problem with that from a public policy perspective? Does that punch us in our gut, or does it tell us that was up to the discretion of the judge?
Sure. Well, let me qualify. Let me qualify a little bit. What I intended to say was that the basic needs language, I thought, was about making sure that whatever the result was, that it met the basic needs. At least someone was willing to certify that it met the basic needs. So it treated it more as a floor, even though we could, on a good basis, we could drop below that number that was calculated, but that we were trying to make sure that we were establishing that whatever the award was, the awards were meeting the basic needs of the child, not intended to be an upper limit on what might happen. But to your point, you're right. We took away the statutory caps, and so it does now continue on ad infinitum, so to speak, with the 2% as those go up with kids. But at the end of the day, I want to make sure that we are making an informed decision as to what this language is going to do. I would not want it to become a limiting factor on the high end any more than it would be to eliminate it altogether, and we're not meeting the needs. That would create some federal problems.
Additional committee comment?
This is Joe Sanford for the record. I just want to state that when we created the table and the percentages, and what that was based off was not the basic needs of the children. That was based off of essentially recreating what a couple who was together would have spent on their children to provide to them, assuming that they remained together. And so the idea was not to just meet the basic needs, but to essentially ensure that children are treated in such a manner as if and supported in a manner as they would have been had the parents maintained the family as best as could be done. And not, you know, a lot of that was based off of basic needs, you know, housing, things like that. But especially as it got towards the higher ends, you know, that was based more on this is what, you know, an income earner of, you know, $50,000 a month would be spending on his children if that child was still in his home. And so it wasn't, I mean, it was presumed to meet those basic needs, but it is significantly more than the old statutory caps was sort of the basic needs idea. And we have addressed that. And so my recollection of why we have it is presumed that the basic needs are met by this child support obligation is more along the lines of saying, you should be presumed, not that you have to, because obviously there are cases where it doesn't. But you shouldn't be saying, okay, I don't think 14% is enough just because I think kids are expensive and therefore I'm going to set it at 20. That I think was the basic idea behind that language.
This is Karen from Clark. I don't feel comfortable certifying that the basic needs of the child are met from the low income schedule. I feel like the schedule focuses more on the ability to pay aspect of the federal regs. But I find it hard to presume that the basic needs of a child are met in looking at that low income schedule.
Well, and that's our old language, right? The presumption language, which I believe did come out of the feds. But I guess the concept is it doesn't meet the child's needs, but the court, it's the best that can happen, right, in the scenario based on the low income scenario. That first sentence, I mean, okay, so the new sentence that's proposed, a child support order is intended to address the obligor's legal obligation to assist the obligee in meeting the basic needs of the child. Intended to address, but I mean, it doesn't take out the presumption language either. Yeah, they have a legal obligation to assist in the needs of the child. I mean, yeah, it does that, right? Even if it's beyond the basic needs, it's still assisting in meeting the basic needs. I'm not sure this language is doing, I don't know what it does exactly, I have to say. I agree with you on the presumption on the low income. I think the reason that language like that's ever been structured is just to say that, well, we've said the original amount, right, is what meets the child's basic needs, but then if there's no ability to pay, then it's been decreased, it's been adjusted. That's what's happening there. The presumption, I don't think, went away of the original child support amount being the proper amount, but anybody that earns that small amount on the low income schedule on both sides isn't really meeting the needs of the child anyways. They're having a hard time, they're struggling. Does it meet their needs? No, but does it meet their needs in the context of that family? Maybe that's how you have to look at it. I don't know. Additional committee comments? Okay, Mr. Willick, you had your hand up for a moment. Did you want to follow up with some other comments?
Just very briefly, you chose to start this review at NAC 425.100 and addressing some of Mr. Sanford's comments and some of your own, Madam Chair, and even a little bit of Ms. Cliff's. There was a new proposal for a 425, which was marked 425.x because we didn't have a a number, which attempts to talk about the order of calculations, which leads to the same conclusion as to what the total child support would be. That's a little different than the purpose as set forth here in 2. But if you take a look at 425X, it says that a child support obligation is determined after alimony and other payments, then calculating.
Hold on, Mr. Willick, just because I have to follow very strict public meeting rules on our agenda. But I will state that Mr. Sanford, that was what he was assigned to because we did not like the language in X in the last meeting. The words then were not going to work for this committee. So that's where Mr. Sanford was saying what he was assigned to do and how it can be incorporated into edits from this section from 425.100. So I think what I'm hearing right now from the committee, well, let's find out if we're hearing this. Committee, are we okay with Mr. Sanford moving forward with the direction he was going on his approach for dealing with this issue of the language on guideline schedule and a new section? Committee thoughts?
This is Judge Rob, and yes, please.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. I think Mr. Sanford, you're going the right direction with that. We'd like you to proceed with it. Any appetite from the committee on this language at the beginning of subsection 2 from AAML? Hearing none, we'll move on. Let's see, is there any other substance in here we need to? This part down here is different too. And 3B, the reorganization of section 3 of this statute. Adding a section B, provide in the findings of fact the basis for the adjustment from the guideline schedule. Ignoring the fact that Mr. Sanford's working on some of this language for us on that guideline schedule, what are the thoughts about this adding a section for providing in the findings of fact the basis for the adjustment?
Madam Chair, this is Bridget Robb. I believe in looking at, if I'm recalling correctly, the other sections that we are going to be dealing with today, they all, unless I'm missing it, say that we need to make as district judges findings of fact that support the basis for the adjustment. This may be duplicative.
Okay.
And Mr. Roth, this is Joe Sanford for the record. I believe that is actually part of the A that got struck out. It's just hard to see here. It looks like this is just mostly a change from deviation to adjustment in a very confusing way. But
Okay.
that's all I see that's actually different between A that's struck out and the new B is the change of the word deviation to adjustment, which I am in agreement with. But if it's something other than that was intended, then maybe I'm not. But I think that's the only difference I actually see.
Okay, do I have somebody that's willing to make a motion that all references to deviation be changed to adjustment within the master document?
This is
Karen
Bridget Robb,
motion.
so moved.
I'll second.
Okay, Judge Robb is the first, second from Ms. Cliff. Any further discussion? All in favor state aye.
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 Opposed? Abstentions? Motion passes. All right, I'm gonna make a note for myself first. Okay. I will state too, for the committee's sake, I think that now that we have actual NACs and we're making specific word changes, we won't have as much trouble with it going through LCB as we did before, where they had to create it from scratch from our prior work. So I think we'll have an easier time. Okay, we're going to move on to agenda item number 8, discussion and recommendations on AAML recommended changes to NAC 425.110. And let me get that on the screen for you. Oh, all right, Mr. Willick, I see that the change here is the guidelines to guideline schedule. But there is another additional edit out. Is there specific comments you want to make on this one?
Very briefly, you've already got it. Again, this is the terminology piece. You don't want to have a provision which says that the parties may stipulate to a child support obligation that doesn't comply with Nevada's child support guidelines. The intended purpose was that it can be a matter outside of the calculation of the guideline schedule. If Mr. Sanford is working on language that will encompass this distinction throughout the regulations, then fine. But this is what the terminology problem was in our original memorandum in November, which is causing some confusion at the district court level. And that distinction somehow needs to be made throughout the regulations.
So this is Karen from Clark, and I appreciate what Mr. Willick has identified. This might have come forward on behalf of the state because, obviously there's a debt that's owed to the state, and there are instances where the guidelines call for a certain amount to be assigned to the state per month, but there are opportunities for the parties to stipulate to a lower amount. And so I think there was a fear with the district court rejecting some of those stipulations that fell below the guidelines because they would see Nevada state welfare in the caption. But we can make it work. But that might have been one of the reasons, but I'll defer to the panel if there were others.
No, I think you're right. This is where the word guidelines doesn't hurt as bad because we're talking about something below anything set forth in the entire guidelines, right? As child support, and the parties can stipulate to 0. And then the word guidelines actually works because it meant there weren't any other adjustments, nothing else was, but that the parties can opt out essentially of the guidelines as a whole and stipulate to something different. But we're working on the language. So I think this is good guidance for us right now for what we're working on. And I think we could probably, Mr. Sanford, we're not going to leave you alone in this arena. We'll make sure we get somebody else towards the end of the meeting that's working on it with you. Okay. Moving on to agenda item number
Mr.
9.
Ott,
Yes, go ahead.
I'm sorry, can I stop you? Can we make sure we do the public comment
Public
in each one?
comment,
It's in your
yes.
agenda. And
Please
thank you,
interrupt
Kathleen,
me.
for catching that earlier.
All right, which was the last one I did? I did it through 5 before, or 6. So with AML on the last agenda item that we just did regarding NAC 425.100, agenda item number 7, can we please take public comment?
To give public comment, please raise your hand in the Zoom meeting or press *9 on your phone to take your place in the queue. I'm showing no hands are raised at this time.
All right, thank you. Can we now take public comment agenda item number 8 regarding recommended changes to NAC 425.110?
To give public comment, please raise your hand in the Zoom meeting or press *9 on your phone to take your place in the queue. I'm showing no hands are raised at this time.
Thank you. Interrupt me, please. I'm used to the old way we were doing the meetings. All right, agenda item number 9, discussion and recommendations on AAML recommended changes to NAC 425.115. That is exhibit 6 that was provided to the committee. And all right, go ahead, Mr. Willick.
I can be very brief, I think. This is part of the structural reordering that we have recommended, essentially emulating NRCP 16.2 insofar as the regulations be reordered to set up 2 off-ramps at the start, one for stipulations and one for the low income schedule. And if neither of those off-ramps are taken, the court is to proceed in its next procedural step to establishing a guideline schedule amount, essentially the calculation, before proceeding to adjustments and then dealing with childcare and medical matters. This is part of the overall structural changes, but I think it's clear enough unless somebody has a particular question. There was one other wording change down in 4, which is simply a grammar item.
Okay, thank you. Committee discussion.
This is Karen from Clark, and I really like this section, and I like what he's trying to accomplish here. Thank you, Mr. Willick.
Okay, additional committee comment.
Kathleen Baker. I would just say that I also appreciate what Mr. Wilk is trying to accomplish, but my memories of our discussing how we were going to develop our child support formula started out sort of with the fact that the feds do not like deviations. And so my recollection is that we decided that we would have our initial child support formula be the percentage plus or minus, the child care costs, plus or minus any health insurance costs, because that got rid of what was 125B 070, 0809 A and B. And I know we're working on putting the child care costs into the section with the percentages, but we somehow never addressed the actual split of the cost of the health insurance. So I think that if we're going to do the ordering, that the ordering would be calculating the percentage, adding or subtracting any childcare, adding or subtracting any health insurance costs, and then moving to the adjustments.
Okay, well, the reorganization will be taking place in a discussion in a different agenda item where they have a proposal for reorganizing all of it. What we're really looking at here is just the adding of the language where it says determining child support if no stipulation and if you're not using the low income schedule, then adjustment of obligation based on. I kind of like that language. I don't mind it. Obviously those are the 2 exceptions. But this isn't as far as it goes as far as the recommendations on reorganizing it and what goes first, what goes second. Those recommendations are coming. I asked them to strip down to just the edits separate from the reorganizing because the full document was really difficult for me to build an agenda around. So it was really complicated for us all to look at the exact additional changes versus the reorganizing changes, if that helps.
This is Karen from Clark. Would it benefit if in the first paragraph, NAC 425.115, it read calculation of obligation based upon type of custody? Or Kathleen, was it the word adjustment that kind of threw it off a little bit?
I think probably determination, calculation are similar as long as everybody understands what we're doing with it. So I don't know that that's as important, but I think that I do think the idea of using the, if we're not using the low income schedule or a stipulation, that then we move forward to the calculations.
I like the word calculation better in that paragraph that you just suggested, Ms. Cliff.
This is Joe Sam, for the record, the only, and maybe it does get addressed. My only concern with totally stripping out the low income table is I believe that that we still are wanting to have, even if you're on the low income table, to still address the medical support and the child custody stuff. And so this is sort of a strange, I guess, section to have it get carved out. But if the more it gets carved out, I'm worried that we'll end up having two separate, I guess, whatever section we end up wanting to have, where we're gonna have to say, okay, well, you're gonna have the low income table section and it's calculated like this versus the regular schedule and it's calculated like this. And overlap in those two things. And so I don't want folks to say, oh, well, you're on the low income table, so we don't do health insurance and we don't do child custody. You're, now, and I know a lot of times that those will get equitably changed if you're on the low income scale. But that was my only concern with carving it out here, where it kind of makes it seem like if you're on the low income table, maybe you don't do some of these other things.
I agree with you, Mr. Sanford. Other committee comments? What about the any committee comments on the edits in section 3 and 4?
I like them. I think this is Keith Pickard for the record. I think that the grammatical change makes a lot of sense. And I think it was always assumed that when in sub 3, where we talk about the obligation of each party, the assumption was as an obligor, but this certainly doesn't hurt anything and does tend to clarify it. So I like them personally. But then I tend to be verbose. Just ask Judge Hoskin.
All right. Yes.
This
Judge
is
Rob.
Bridget Robb, and I agree with Senator Pickard, particularly since I think in this we are going to need to be verbose because there seems to be an inability to kind of read behind the words of the statute. So let's be as clear as possible.
All right. Do we have a motion?
This is Bridget Robb. Move to approve that language.
Let's be clear. That language, the edits in section 3.
The edits in
4
section 3 and 4.
of Exhibit 6.
And I'll second that.
Correct. Thank you.
Okay, and a second from Senator Pickard. Any further discussion? All in favor, state aye.
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 Anyone opposed? Any abstentions? Motion passes. All right. Any further discussions on the edits in this section before we move on? Okay,
Public comment.
public comment, thank you. I was literally gonna miss it again. Joy, can we please take public comment on agenda item number 9?
To give public comment, please raise your hand in the Zoom meeting or press star 9 on your phone to take your place in the queue. I'm showing no hands are raised at this time.
All right, thank you. I'm set in my ways from how the committee did it before. All right, we are moving on to agenda item number 10, discussion and recommendations on AAML. Recommended changes to NAC 425.120. Oh, I did the wrong exhibit. Let me get it for you. I mixed up agenda item number 10 with what exhibit number. There we go. All right, Mr. Willick, you're on.
Very briefly, the new subsection 3 is part of what was set out in the memorandum of November 29th of breaking up one of the existing sections, one saying what is to be done, and the later and more detailed section indicating how to do it. It has really 2 points. One, the court is to make a decision whether somebody is underemployed or unemployed, and giving the court the power at this step, and this is part of the reorganization, to determine to impute income. This relates back to the prior provision indicating that the guideline schedule is to be, the calculation is to be applied against imputed income. And it's to be the imputed income of the obligor, as opposed to what some judges have done, saying a percentage of income of the obligor spouse or various other interpretations. This goes back to a meeting, and I don't remember the date, where various members of this committee said that that was obviously what you intended. But with respect, it's not obvious to everybody. And so the point was to set out in specific language that the imputed income has to do with the obligor personally, as opposed to any other person.
Okay, committee discussion? Or questions
Madam
for
Chair.
Mr. Willick either way? Yes, Judge Hoskin.
I guess I don't know that it's a concern, but it's something that I noticed on there, that the language both proposed in 425-120 and the next agenda item, certainly I understand we're not on that yet, but it's the same thing. We've taken out the without good cause language in making that determination. So that will have an effect on how the court looks at this scenario. And it looks like we've added that in accordance with the earning capacity of that obligor. And I'm fine with leaving that discretionary with the court, but I just want to make the point that would make that calculation or that analysis more discretionary with the court under the language proposed than I think how it currently is. So not really question, but more of a comment that perhaps we need to make sure we know what we're trying to accomplish here.
And this is Keith Pickard for the record. I agree with Judge Hoskin. I was going to address this in the next one anyway. I'm going to resist the idea of taking out good cause, because there are going to be instances. I've got a case right now, fortunately not in front of any of the judges here, that the family, the grandmother is incapacitated. She's an invalid, bedridden, and they are all low income earners. And so they made a family decision that one of the adult children would stay home with mom, care for mom, and another sibling would, and they were going to live together, and the other sibling would make enough money to cover their needs. And so if we take out good cause, but we leave it to, well, he's deliberately underemployed, there's no question about that. My concern is that it weakens the ability of families to make those kind of determinations, or at least it opens the door to missing those. Obviously, it's still within the discretion of the court, and the courts generally do a good job of addressing those kinds of things. So I would still like to have that language in this sub 3, but actually the thing that I'm struggling with is taking the language if after taking evidence. And the reason is I recently had a judge tell me that we don't take evidence in motion hearings. So this would require an evidentiary hearing, and it would then arguably in some minds prevent us from imputing income at the interim stage. Now, of course, judges can always put people under oath and take evidence, and that regularly happens. But if we make this clear that they have to take evidence, and maybe the judge doesn't put a party under oath, they don't take those evidentiary steps, now we're precluding imputation at the motion hearing. And I think that's going to hurt the obligee in that now we don't have the benefit of imputed income. That's just my reaction. It was a recent thing, and so I'd be interested to see if anybody else has that concern.
Okay, so to summarize real quick, I mean, the if after taking evidence was in the original language in 425.125, we already had that language, but you're bringing it up as a new issue, that's fine. But we're looking, AAML's request is basically moving that language from 425.125 into 120, but they did remove, as noted, the without good cause, which was very intensely discussed by this committee and included purposefully, just to get us all on the same page of what we're looking at right now. Additional committee comments?
Jack Fleeman, Madam Chair.
Yes.
Just in response to what Senator Pickard said, I kind of have the same feeling that he does with regard to the taking of evidence, but I actually think it makes sense. I don't think that the final child support obligation obviously should be calculated until there is some evidence taken or there's an agreement. I think the problem with placing people under oath at motion hearings and things like that is you already have, or you should have, a financial disclosure form that's signed anyways, and that is pretty much their testimony. I don't think that pro pers or even represented parties are going to be able to effectively testify under oath at a motion hearing. I think the court needs to just make those interim orders. And I think that the court reserves the right, because they're temporary orders, to modify or to go back and give some constructive arrears on that. So I think I like the evidence language. I think it should stay in there.
I'd be interested from Ms. Cliff. Oh, go ahead.
Right.
You're about to talk.
This is Karen from Clark. I just wanted to sort of make it really clear that if we're looking at, kind of removing that language altogether, I don't know if we want to have another agenda item so that the public comment would be appropriate, because I think this is, I don't want to speak for Mr. Willick, but I think this is just taking the language that's already there, as you indicated earlier, Kim, and just adding it to this particular section. So,
except they did edit it. So it was on the agenda properly with the exhibit. They removed some of our language. They removed the without good cause, which was Judge Hoskins' comment. He would like it put back in. And because of the language that's here, we could discuss whether or not the language, if after taking evidence, should remain here. I guess we need to break it down into pieces. One, does the committee have an issue with moving the language from 425.125 into 120? That's number one. Number two, does the committee want to keep the language that AAML proposed or edit it to the language that we originally, or add without good cause? And number three would be, does the language stay here with if after taking evidence, or does that language get removed? I think those are the three breakdowns we're at.
There's one more.
Oh, is there a fourth? What is it?
Yeah, because they added the language in accordance with the earning capacity of that obligor,
Okay.
which wasn't in the original.
Another edit. Okay.
Yes.
So let's start with the move of the language into section 120. How does the committee feel about it moving?
well, this is Karen from Clark. I don't know if I have a strong opinion about it being moved, but I like that it follows with, if the court imputes income, they have to take into consideration sort of all of these different elements. And I like that that's easy. I like the flow there. So I don't know if it's going to remain here. I would like that other section attached to it.
Okay, additional committee comments?
This is Joe Salmon for the record. I tend to agree with Ms. Cliff, which is, if we do move it here, I'm not sure there's a reason for 125 to exist, because then we got to put the second subsection here, which goes into what exactly imputing income means. On that first section, on the move, I guess I'm not opposed to combining 125 with 120. I don't have strong feelings. I do have some strong feelings about them being completely separate, so I think it's confusing then. But if it's one that's to be combined or stay separate, I think is either way is fine. But I don't want it to be hanging by itself.
And this is Keith Pickard for the record. I'll just jump in here. I know in working with LCB over the years, They like to have discrete sections so that we're not combining concepts, which is, I think, why they broke them into two. I think that rather makes sense because we can introduce the concept of imputation into the determination of the gross monthly income and then have a separate section. That's something that LCB does regularly in drafting legislation. So to me, the separation looks natural.
Okay. I believe if we, as a committee, are not agreeing to it being moved, then we'll be discussing 425, 125 in a moment. But let's go ahead. Is there any appetite for the other changes made? Let's start with the if after taking evidence.
Yeah, let me remove that just because this was kind of reactionary. And I saw that and I thought, well, this adds a wrinkle, but I think Mr. Fleeman's suggestion is spot on. Frankly, the motions and oppositions are sworn or at least verified by the parties. And so I think there's sufficient reason to think that that's evidence, even though they're not taking evidence at a hearing per se. So I think that with that distinction or with that on the record, I'm okay with just deleting that suggestion and leaving it in place.
All right, then the next one is regarding their adding of language to the end. I'm looking at the old language. Hold on. In accordance with the earning capacity of that obligor.
This is Karen from Clark. I like where they're trying to go with this, but I think it's too narrow. The imputation of income is in accordance with the respondent's assets, their residence, their employment and earning history. It's all of the elements that we've put forth. I don't know if it's necessarily just their earning capacity, but I see where you could kind of interpret it that way as well. But maybe their earning capacity is based on sort of all of these other things, but I don't know. I'm not a fan of narrowing it like that, but.
Well, for clarity too, for the deputy DAs, you guys are dealing with imputation all the time from people for lack of evidence, right? Lack of information, doing the best you can with what you've got. And that's what we have to keep in mind is both sides of this, not just the private, but also the DWSS side of it. So.
Yeah, this is Karen again. We can go either way. I mean, if the committee feels like this would be a benefit, I thought the section read fine just the way it was before. But.
Yeah, I think it stomps on 425.125 section 2. We gave a very clean definition with lots of information, and this alleviates it. So.
Well, the one thing, this is Keith Pickard, the one thing I will say is that when we're talking about the determination, it does make sense to include some reference to imputation at this point, because 125, because of that separation, it looks like it's a different piece entirely. Maybe we just say, if after taking evidence, the court determines that an obligor is underemployed or unemployed, the court may impute income pursuant to NAC 425.125, then it moves us down to 125 to go through the steps.
Well, except that as a committee, we decided not to move this into 120, to keep it into 125.
No, I understand that.
Okay. So subsection 1 could reference, then the court moves on to subsection 2 if you need to. This is where.
Sure.
I don't know. I don't know what the point is, but all right,
And
additional.
Madam Chair, this is Bridget Robb. I agree with Ms. Clift, although she kind of wavered at the end. I think, and it was a note to myself before we ever got to this discussion, when I read this, I believe that this language is too narrow, and I think it's going to cause more problems than it's going to assist. I'd like to have it removed.
And this is Margot Chappell for the record. I would agree. One of the thoughts that I had as I was looking at this, I thought there could be an an opportunity for this to be used in a discriminatory way. We may find out it through, if we ever collected statistics on it. Like, for example, if a ethnic group, a family from a certain ethnic group that's more family oriented, as the description that the senator gave, makes decisions based on family, but to make less money, then it's very possible we could see problems with that in courts, and I'd prefer to avoid that. Thank you.
I will note that the one part that I latched onto from Mr. Willick's comment was that we're looking at this obligor, not other obligors, or the greater, you know, if that's an issue, if that's a growing issue, I haven't heard of it being an issue with imputed income with the greater detail. We have so much more detail than we ever had in the NRSs on this in our prior versions. So, all right, is there any motions, or are we moving on?
I guess this is Joe, for the record. I just want to say I hear what Mr. Willick is saying. I think the concern with imputing income of a spouse is, and obviously it does happen. We don't get these stories for no reason, but I think it's prevalent whether you're looking at adjustment factors or whether you're looking at the imputed income or whatever. I think it's something that if we want to address, I'm not sure that it needs to be addressed specifically within imputed income. When I think it's mostly just, look, we all see cases where someone's staying at home because the spouse makes significantly more money and there's a desire to impute income there. And however it's done, whether it's a percentage of the spouse's earnings or whatever, there is a desire there. And so I'm just not sure that this is the spot so much as I think it is something that has been addressed, or we've tried to address, and maybe it needs more addressing, and maybe this is the place, but I think that is the concern. I'm just not sure that this language is fits there, when I think that our current 425.2 does a better job if it's actually read as it should be. I think, you know, it all says the obligor's assets and residence. It doesn't have, you know, spousal information in there. Anyway, that's just my 2 cents.
I did hear a complaint about that, about a judge utilized 1/2 of the spouse's income as the mechanism for imputing income, for deciding how much income was going to be imputed to the person. Now, we don't have the actual calculation here on how you determine what you're imputing. We're just saying that these things have to be considered when the court imputes income. And it just says must take into consideration. It doesn't say these factors. Maybe we should move on to the next agenda item, though, because what we're doing is talking about the next statute through this one edit. And if we don't have edits here, I'll move on to the next agenda item and we'll talk about this some more, if that works.
Yeah, we can table this for now, and then we can come back to it if we think we need to.
Okay. Ms. Tomlinson, if you could please take public comment on agenda item number 10.
To give public comment, please raise your hand in the Zoom meeting or press *9 on your phone to take your place in the queue. I'm showing no hands are raised at this time.
All right, thank you. We're going to move on to agenda item number 11, discussion and recommendations on Aaml. Recommended changes to NAC 425.125. This is exhibit number 8, where I feel more comfortable continuing my conversation I was just having. Where it's, you know, it talks about if the court imputes income, court must take into consideration. And what the one complaint I have heard is, but that still doesn't tell us how they come to an actual calculation of how much income's imputed, and that a judge utilized the spouse's income as the one half of the spouse's income as the means of imputing income. Now, I told that person they could argue that everything listed here wasn't necessarily taken into consideration, but maybe it was taken into consideration. The judge, that's just what they utilize as a mechanism for imputing income. I get the edit that AML had made, which is looking at that obligor's ability to earn, and what they can earn is, you know, you've got to take these things into consideration and what their ability to earn is for that obligor, and maybe that takes the spouse part out of it, but I don't know. What we did decide on the last agenda item is that number 1 is not being deleted in this. And there's some additional edits in the first section here. And Mr. Willick, if you want to address those, and then we will discuss it. There's nothing at the bottom, right? No. Okay. As a committee.
I believe the committee has captured our intention entirely. It was moved from here to there because it's part of the structural changes. And Senator Pickard is exactly correct. That's why our proposed restructuring drops this down about 10 sections as simply an operative section. The good cause elimination was intended to increase judicial discretion to impute income, even if the court finds that they had a very good reason to be unemployed, because income imputation is historically appropriate when people have very good reasons not to be employed, because it doesn't make any sense to be employed. But yes, and you are exactly correct, Madam Chair, that the purpose of the last few words was to target any imputation of income to be targeted to the obligor as opposed to a third party.
Okay, committee comments. All right, I will, for the record, state that there is extensive committee testimony in the first iteration of this committee that went through inclusion of the words "without good cause." It was done very intentionally. The targeted issue that I just targeted, I don't know that I still am concerned that that language where you just add the court may impute income to the obligor. Actually, they just deleted it. Here was the language from the prior agenda item about that obligor's income, ignores the rest of what's in section 2 and doesn't necessarily incorporate it. So I don't know. I understand the issue. I just don't know the solution, and I don't think this is the solution. Additional committee comments?
Margot Chapel, for the record, I agree with you about the without good cause piece, because that provides some protection to the person for whom the decision and the imputation is happening.
Yeah, I mean, if they are underemployed or unemployed because they're disabled and they were injured or they're in the hospital, I mean, that's what
Someone in their family is.
Yeah, we were trying to protect for those circumstances.
Yeah, exactly. I get that. And so, yeah, I worry about that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, that discussion was keep without good cause in there, but we got rid of the intent to avoid child support language, because that part was the ridiculous part to try to have to prove in court. It was nearly impossible to prove in court. So, but without good cause, now we're just saying you could have you could be disabled and in bed, but we're going to impute income to you. No, that wasn't the intent of this section, and it kills the intent. Additional comments? All right, Ms. Tomlinson, will you please take public comment on agenda item number 11?
To give public comment, please raise your hand in the Zoom meeting or press star 9 on your phone to take your place in the queue. I'm showing no hands are raised at this time.
All right. We are on Exhibit 9, or Agenda Item number 12, discussion and recommendations on AAML recommended changes to NAC 425.130, referencing Exhibit 9. The language is on the screen, and Mr. Willick, you are welcome to present.
It's really pretty simple. This is part of the structural reordering, trying to figure out what gets done in which order. So I think Mr. Sanford is already on top of that and considering these possibilities. But there was, I should probably clarify, there was no policy choice from the AAML to delete childcare costs or medical expenses from the low income schedule. And if additional language had to be added here to say after calculation in accordance with the guideline schedule or per the low income schedule, that's fine. There was no policy choice trying to exclude this consideration from cases that took the off ramp. We believe that the guideline schedule amount has to be established and then adjusted, and then these come after it. But if you go back to our memo, the original intent of the committee, if you go back to the original language, was unclear as to whether these two matters were to be brought up after calculation of guideline schedule child support or not. So we were simply trying to organize the steps that a district court judge should follow in establishing a total child support obligation. And again, this circles back to what Mr. Sanford's doing. If you choose a different mechanism for organizing those steps, it should be clear anyway. But if you wanted to eliminate an ambiguity here, you could say, the guideline schedule or the low income schedule. And for that matter, you probably need to take care of stipulations too, or consciously exclude them from this list and say the stipulation parties will either agree to it or not agree to it. And that's part of the court's determination accepting the stipulation.
Okay, and then I would note there is, and maybe you want to comment to it, there is a substantive change here, or maybe it's not it's a very different change in language from the court must allocate the reasonable cost of childcare and getting rid of the language and make an equitable division. So allocate versus equitable division, I guess, is the change.
And I apologize if I omitted that. There's been some debate in district courts where the issue has come up, whether the choice of the words equitable meant that the court is to do something that is not defined in terms of how to divide the cost. Traditionally, under the old statutes, courts sometimes dealt with childcare ratably, by percentage of the comparative incomes, almost an income shares concept for child care costs. But again, the whole point, and this came up in the 3 prior examinations of our statutes, that's why child care and medical expenses were broken out from the guideline schedule calculations to allow the distribution of those costs, that's why the word allocate was used, to be different than the straight calculation of guideline support. This is an add-on. At least we believe it's to be an add-on.
Okay, so I feel that what I hear from people is always try to mush. I'm not saying you're doing this, Mr. Willick. I'm just encapsulating what I hear from people. Trying to mush the old way we used to do into the new way we do things, right? And so I'm constantly getting told, is it 50-50? Is that what equitable means? And I don't know if allocates any more detail to answer that problem or versus equitable division. I think equitable division says a lot to our judges in terms of do something that's fair. Allocate seems very generic to me, but do we have committee comments on the change as a whole? Thoughts on changing equitable division to allocate?
Madam Chair,
Yes.
this is Bridget Robb. I think it's a distinction without a difference, quite frankly. Either way, allocate or equitable division, the court is going to divide that. I don't think that the new language is helpful or instructive in how that division is to be made, where equitable may trigger the idea that it's supposed to be fair, as you said. I prefer the original language.
Since Judge Rob said what I was going to say, I'll just be quiet.
Thank you,
Well,
Judge
and
Hoskin.
Judge Hoskin, I was hoping you'd step up and talk about the changes you had suggested to this anyway. You and I kind of already addressed a little bit of this.
Well, you're going to have to refresh my memory because it's not coming to me.
In the document that we passed back and forth on the reasonable costs of childcare,
Here,
weren't
I'll
we
put it-
addressing 130?
I'll put it on here.
Well, see, and
So-
I thought we deleted 130 and put it into, didn't we do that?
Yeah,
Isn't this section already found in 140?
well, that was our intent, but this kind of intersects. And so I wanted to make sure that we noticed that.
No, I'm glad you raised it. We've in the master, I believe we've done away with 130. There it is.
There it is.
Yes,
Right.
So
we did. We
yeah.
got rid of it pending us contemplating some of the edits in the AAML materials. I think
Right.
I'm adding extra A's when I say that sometimes, but
And- So I didn't want to say that this was, that the AAML language here was mooted, because I thought we needed to have the conversation, but I think we've already dealt with it. And personally, I think the way we did it, as is shown on the screen, is, adds the level of explanation that I think we were trying to get at in the AAML language. So I think that it's mooted. Ultimately, we've addressed this, I think.
And I would agree.
yes, and we deleted 130 completely because we moved it down. We moved it into 425.140. I did not suggest a numbering here because I know LCB will change it. So I just got the language there for now. We'll figure out the numbering. Actually, when we make all changes, then I'll figure out numbering if I need to.
Right.
Okay. Any further discussion on this?
This is Joe Sanford for the record, and I know that we had done that. It sort of went in line with what I was doing in terms of trying to create a calculation section. At present, if it stays under 140, that'll just be combined. Or if, my recollection of why we deleted 130 and put it under 140 was sort of because of how confusing it currently was on the timing and when certain things were being done. And so if we're going to make a new section already to sort of create, I think, what this was trying to do, it may be better to keep it separate. But I'll propose both ways when I send kind of my calculation portion, one as if it's going to stay under here as, say, a section 6 or whatever, or whether it should remain as the same language, but say a 425, 130, but be part of a larger calculation towards a total child support award.
And after this meeting, Mr. Sanford, I'll send you the Word document again with where we're at right now, just so that you can keep that rendition in front of you. Okay. Let's take Ms. Tomlinson, if you'll please take public comment on agenda item number 12.
To give public comment, please raise your hand in the Zoom meeting or press *9 on your phone to take your place in the queue. I'm showing no hands are raised at this time.
All right, thank you. We're going to move on to agenda item number 10 or 13. I'm looking at exhibit numbers, I apologize. Discussion and recommendations on AAML recommended changes to NAC 425.135, exhibit 10. And I know this is still in line with exactly what you've been talking about, and it's very repetitive, but if you have additional stuff you'd like to tell us, Mr. Willick, you are welcome to.
No, very briefly, what you were looking at previously, the key word was not the distinction between allocate and equitable. It was the word after, which in the language you just put on the screen from Judge Hoskin and Senator Pickard, they've incorporated, these are people doing the same thing in different ways with the word then. I don't know if you noticed the language. That's exactly what we were trying to do with X, indicate the order of steps. This is more of the same. That's why the word after is here. There's no policy decision trying to change what's being done. We're just trying to clarify the order in which things are done. And again, this is a cat that can be skinned in a couple of different ways, but the purpose was to try to get the order of what is to be done as calculation, adjustment, and then child care and medical support afterward. Whichever mechanism is chosen to achieve that end, it will lead to less confusion in the district courts.
Okay, any committee comment?
Just, I have a comment on that. Is there a reason that you want it to be done in a specific order, other than just that the calculation is the sum of them? Because in my current thought is it's a summation of the calculation, the adjustments, the child care, and the medical care. While I appreciate, that you would want to probably start with the initial calculation, other than that, is there a reason that calculating, say, child care should be done after adjustments, other than just that I'm not aware of, that I'm not thinking of? Because my understanding is we want to ensure that all of these numbers, I think, are being considered together, because you don't want to have so that, I guess that's my question. Is there an order, some reason to the order, other than just we want to make sure that they're considered as one simultaneous decision when you go to do that you've already made your big determinations before you go to, say, childcare?
Madam Chair, may I respond?
Yes, you may.
Yes, this is part of the fallout from the breakout of childcare from a deviation factor under the original statute to a separately considered item. And the problem, both with medical and with childcare, in breaking them out as deviations to making them separate calculations, was there's confusion in the district court as to what to do in which order. Some judges have flatly admitted that what they attempt to do is come up with a fair number and then work their way backward into it. And we're trying to make it deductive rather than inductive, I think is the right word, so that it is exactly what you're saying, Mr. Sanford, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, here's your total. So that it's not just a confused and muddled mess. That was the reason for breaking these items out from deviation factors to individual items in the first place.
Well, the purpose of this committee was that the feds told us we will and we must consider child care separately from medical support separately and child support calculation. So when it's a deviation and it says that your child support can go down because you're paying child care or medical support, then they look at it as a ding against the state of Nevada for the structure of its statutes, because you allowed that deviation versus saying, here's child support in one big chunk, and now we're gonna allocate, I don't mind that word, it's not that bad, the child care and the medical support. Medical support has to be dealt with very specific way though for DWSS. They've got a very different set of rules than we as private attorneys do for that. But additional committee comments? Other than I think this is just it's fallen in line and it's great input and suggestions for what we're considering and what we're working on.
Kathleen Baker for the record. I will state that one thing that AML has pointed out is that they have now included allocation of the cost of medical support, and that is not currently included in our NAC. So we will need to somehow address that. With respect to the order and listening to everybody's conversation, we talked about the equitable division of childcare costs, and now we're talking about possibly the equitable division of the insurance premium costs. And I'm wondering how that plays with the idea of ability to pay. If we were to do equitable, if we were to do the percentage, look at equitable childcare cost, equitable sharing of health insurance premium cost, then I'm wondering how the adjustment factor of ability to pay would play in, and whether the ability to pay actually impacts the other. So I think that when we look at an equitable division of a childcare cost, that we are looking at ability to pay. I think that's one of the things that we look at. So I'm just throwing it out there that just came to my mind. I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts on it, but certainly when we're doing this ordering, that's something to consider, I think.
Of whether the adjustment for ability to pay is also applied to the division of the childcare and the medical support. Is that
Correct.
an interpretation of that? Okay, yeah, I see. I'm following you.
This is Keith Pickard for the record. You know, I think Ms. Baker hits on a really important point. And that is that, you know, the order matters, that, you know, we need to make sure that that's considered. And frankly, I had always viewed the adjustments as that final ability of the court to exercise discretion to right size the award. And so when I saw adjustments here, I kind of tripped on that. And after this discussion, I think we probably should put adjustments at the very end to give the court the ability to right size, because this is something, you know, that's language we used in throughout our initial discussions, right sizing the award. And by making the adjustments occur before the allocation of medical support and childcare costs, we're adding to now what was a right-sized award. And if my concern is that if a court were to say, well, I'm going to apply this adjustment after the fact, now they're in violation of the rule. So I think we should move adjustments to the very end where they were intended. I think they were intended to be.
I agree. I think that's part of the consideration.
This is Judge Rob for the record. If we are going to do that, I would also suggest a reordering so that medical support comes before childcare, because you don't always have a childcare amount. And so if it doesn't exist, that ought to be the last one on the waterfall that we're looking at.
Margot Chapel for the record, I would support that because everybody needs medical care and some families may not need childcare. Thank you.
I agree. And to the extent that the bench is going to look at this order as a de facto priority list, I think that would be appropriate.
This is Joe Sanford for the record. In case, and I'm on board if everybody else is on board, I'm going to recommend that we don't have a specific order at all. Everything needs to be done. It needs to be clear that what the entire calculation entails. I am concerned with adding an order that we're building in error if we don't do it in the right order in a particular hearing, when maybe the outcome is going to remain the same, but we're going to be building in problems that maybe we don't need to be building in. I hate to have a case where we have procedural errors just because we're oh, well, he calculated the health insurance before the adjustment factors, and now if he had done it differently, it'd be different. And I guess what I would say is I think maybe we've already built discretion in each of the child care, the medical support, the adjustment factors themselves. So the only one that doesn't have any discretion initially is the initial calculation. And so I guess that was my only concern is I think if we're saying, hey, this is a sum of these, whichever, you can do it in any order you want to, as the judge. You know, I assume most of them are going to start with a calculation and then go forward. But you know, you're going to get discrete elements based off of what you say. You know, of what the medical support should be, the child care should be, what your factors and the adjustments should be, and then you're going to add them together, as opposed to saying, okay, I'm going to do this. I make my first determination, and then maybe I get to my adjustments at the end, and I think, oh, I've already done, you know, or I've. So that was my only concern is building in error if we say it has to be done in a certain order, as opposed to just saying you must calculate with these items.
Well, that's an interesting point. And I think it's easy to fix by, instead of saying and then or after, just say also. The court shall also consider, and lump them together as, here is the universe of things that we're going to discuss, and you do with it what you need to do. I like that idea.
Yeah, that's exactly what Mr. Sanford's been saying all along too, with the sum of child support is the sum of, and we don't have that clear language. We have some mishmashed language in there. It does need to be fixed to be clear that that is the sum of it, and it all needs to be part of it. And we get rid of some of the after this, after that. It gets rid of some of the wordiness through all the other changes that aren't needed. We could even reference when we say it's the sum of, we can reference the actual NACs that need to be summed up. Then we don't have to have all the additional language. Okay. Additional discussion on agenda item number 10. Hearing none, Ms. Tomlinson, will you please take public comment on agenda item number 10?
To give public comment, please raise your hand in the Zoom meeting or press star 9 on your phone to take your place in the queue.
Just for clarity, I believe it was Exhibit 10, Agenda Item 13.
I did it again. I'm having quite the day with this, aren't I? You're right. Agenda item number 13, exhibit number 10 for public comment.
And I'm showing no hands are raised at this time.
Okay, thank you. We're moving on. Okay. To agenda item number 14, discussion and recommendations on AAML recommended changes to NAC 425.150, exhibit 11. And Mr. Willick, if you'd like to proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. There's three very different things going on in 1F, and in 1H, and they should be probably considered separately. One is probably simplest. The words mean what they say. And again, if you change the order of how things are done, then some of this may have to be changed. There was no policy choice being made. We were simply trying to make clear what was to be done by a district court judge because of the confusion we've noted in existing district court decisions. But where we went with this is that first we establish a guideline schedule, and then we adjust if the evidence demonstrates that a particular child's needs are not being met or exceeded. Word has come out that district court judges are not looking to the needs of a particular child. It's sort of detailed, and I'm sorry to go into the weeds too much, but it's in one of the articles that we submitted. There was a line of case law from the 90s indicating that child support was not to be allocated in accordance with the needs of a particular child, but could be sort of holistic based on a bunch of factors. What we perceived from the existing regulations was that the child support awards were rejecting that line of case authority and looking at the needs of a particular child. So Section 1 redirects judges to look at the needs of the specific child in making the adjustments, as opposed to something nebulous like, oh, differentials in household income or whatever, in terms of general fairness, that any child support award has to be targeted to the needs of the specific child and whether they're exceeded or not. Moving down to subject F, this has been very problematic in a number of cases that have come to multiple members of the Academy. Some judges have apparently used relative income of both households as a super adjustment factor, choosing that if there's a significant income differential between parent A and parent B, you simply double or triple or quadruple the child support amount. And that word, that notice of these real world cases is what led, I believe, and again, I'm missing Mr. Metter, who would be better to explain why he wrote what he wrote in his memo, to request that F get special attention as an adjustment factor. The intention here was to specify what a judge is supposed to look at when looking at the relative income of both households. This is where new spouse or cohabitant subsidization of the household comes in, but not a super adjustment factor, basically a third swipe at the apple in terms of increasing child support just because there's an income differential. That was supposed to be taken care of in the schedule itself by the inclusion of the lowering percentage of much higher income as you go forward in the income stream. If there's any questions, I'll answer them, but this is, and the other piece of F is that it includes imputed income as part of what is to be compared in that factor. And then moving into H, this goes to the discussion from about 4 meetings ago, where multiple members of this committee said that ability to pay was not yet another invitation to a judge to increase child support based on high income earners, but was originally intended to be in the old language, a downward deviation factor based on an inability to make legitimate other expenses. This is the rent versus Porsche conversation from about 4 meetings ago. If I can get back into it, but it's in our November 29th memo, if anybody wants the background for why this language was made a little bit longer, but more specific. And I'll be glad to answer any questions, because these words were all very deliberately chosen to have specific moderating effects on what goes on in courtrooms in the real world.
Okay, let's start with section 1, just so we have where this first paragraph of edits, just to break it apart a little bit. Do you have any committee comments or questions on that part?
I'll jump in, Keith Pickard for the record. The one thing I don't really feel comfortable with is deleting the language regarding the economic circumstances of the parties, because that's part of the reality that judges have to deal with. I would like to hear from the judges as to how they think this would change their approach to adjustments. If this would eliminate consideration of the economic situation entirely, because that's my concern. I don't think that, because later on we talk about the ability to pay, the economic circumstances may be unusual, and I think it should be considered when considering adjustments.
Well, just Judge Hoskin, I think that in my mind, it previously was probably duplicative. The economic circumstances are those factors A through H. That's what I'm considering. So if A through H remain in, then I'm considering the economic circumstances of the parties based upon that, unless we want to make more clarification. So I don't know that I've got heartburn about taking that out, as long as we leave the ability to consider those factors. So I guess that's my position on that point.
This is Joe Sanford for the record. I'm going to agree with Senator Pickard. I have some concern, not so much, I think it's by taking out the economic circumstances of the parties as a basis for deviation. Because at least as far as I would read the changes, you would need to have a specific need of a child that needs to be met to do a deviation. And so, I think, say we have legal responsibility to support other parties. Are we going to be considering those other children that aren't even necessarily a party of the case? Is that what we're looking at for that case? And so I would look at that more as that's an economic circumstance of the parties, more than a specific need of the child, or say of a particular child. Say sometimes legal responsibility, we've had one recently, was legal responsibility to care for say like a dependent adult. And so I think the economic circumstances of the parties is a little more broad. And at least when I was hearing from Ms. Willick, it seemed like there was maybe some reading into what we had done about sort of denying some prior case law about the holistic approach. And at least I don't remember that being a conversation that we had at all. And so to the extent that was a desire, I don't remember that. Maybe I just missed that meeting. But I think that this maybe reads into these adjustments being more narrow and more specific to particular, more like the special needs of a child specifically, more than trying to create, I guess, the equalization in the homes for the children.
I would add that this section was crafted significantly off of the language out of the federal final ruling, in trying to make sure that we met all of our duties and obligations there. So I know we were trying to borrow language from their ability to pay, which I know is in the subsection H, but ability to pay was reiterated and burned into our brains that it had to be incorporated in here somewhere, somehow, some way. When I just pulled the federal rule, the final rule, it is in the summary. I didn't dig into the exact subsections, but just in the summary, it talks about how guidelines must consider all earnings and income of the non-custodial parent. It says that we must provide that a child support order be based on the non-custodial parent's earnings, income, and other evidence of ability to pay. Now, the only way we could really get ability to pay in was to put it in here in the adjustments, right? And then we were still worried about deviation factors from the prior statutes that needed to still survive. And that's how we started to construct this statute. I don't know what, I'm not sure about the holistic comment either, but that's how this statute, came alive, was those two considerations. Those were probably the two most important considerations. Then the third part, which was huge amount of discussions, was that relative income of both households, because we knew from a public policy perspective, if we didn't start considering that, that was the intent and purpose behind our committee. Or how it was designed or allowed to come to light at the legislature. So that had to be considered, and the public was beating down our door for that consideration. So when I just think about all those three things, those things that forced us to write the statute and what we needed to write them on. And I think about the specific needs of the child and the economic circumstances of the parties. I don't know that language is needed there. Again, the comment was, well, it's in the factors. The factors, the A through H is what's most important here. The intro paragraph is somewhat important, but not as important. I do know that the reason why Mr. Metter probably recommended the specific needs of a particular child are not met or are exceeded by the scheduled obligation is that concern about the limitless child support, right, for the high income earners. Am I on track there, Mr. Willick? Okay, so that's the purpose of, or the reasoning behind that edit. That's my initial comments on that. Any other committee comments, Mr. Oh, you don't have your hand raised, but I just see a yellow line around you. Other committee comments?
This is Bridget Robb. Judge Hoskin, I would be interested in your take. The are exceeded by, that language right there strikes me as that is going to come up now in every single argument that is ever made, that this child support is way too high for this child. And that's something that needs to be looked at. And when I look at that language and what it could cause versus the very, very few circumstances where it actually would come into play, I'm concerned about that language. And as I said, Judge Hoskin, I'd be interested in your take.
Oh, I think it does create a very specific argument on a regular basis. And will it require additional analysis? Yeah, it will. I try and stay out of what I see as more policy with regard to child support, since I would be interpreting it as it comes through. But I don't disagree at all. I think this is opening the door to a lot of litigation on this very specific issue, and probably subject to a lot of appellate review with regard to, are we doing what they think we should be doing with regard to that particular child? So I think you've hit it on the head with regard to that. And if we want to open those floodgates, then certainly the committee has the ability to do that. But I would have a concern with regard to the additional need for judges, I guess, as a result of that additional litigation.
Well,
I just
Judge,
think
I'm
that
sorry. Can I just ask?
Now let Judge Robb respond first, please.
Okay.
It's just, it looks to me like this particular addition of language is a solution in search of a problem, because it's not a problem that I've ever seen, really.
Okay, Senator Pickard.
Sorry, didn't mean to talk over. The argument is still available, isn't it? If someone wants to make that argument, they still can under existing language. My concern is that we're opening a door that is actually already ajar. And so why would we invite more litigation on a point that can already be made?
Additional committee comments?
I think Mr. Willick wanted to weigh in on that point.
Okay, go ahead, Mr. Willick.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify that this was not a policy choice from the Academy. This is a matter of unifying language that this committee has already used, but may not have noticed that it already used. If you go back to NAC 425.100, which was in your prior.
Oh, you cut out, or you're frozen. We'll see if we get them back. He's gonna have to log back in. So he was saying we already have that language in 425-100.
Yeah, in sub 2, it says it is presumed that the basic needs of a child are met. But I don't,
I have no idea what happened there. I apologize for whatever.
No
the technical-
problem.
But yes, I think what Senator Pickard was just saying was exactly what I was trying to say. We didn't make that language up. We simply copied it from the existing general provision in 100. That's where particular child provision came from, and where are not met or are exceeded came from. This was not something we were trying to impose. We were trying to unify the language so there was less confusion between sections.
but
Now,
I think in practical terms, we're changing how it's being used, where in 425-100, we're talking about the presumption of basic needs being met. And so that's a rebuttable presumption as to any particular child. But in this change to 150, we're actually limiting now the adjustments to particular children. And so I think that in application, there's a difference.
And you may be back to a statement of purpose, that which was the reason for the line that was suggested at the beginning of 2. And again, if that's a political choice, that's not an academy technical recommendation. You need to choose what the purpose of the regulations totally and of the guideline schedule specifically is. And if that is clear, everything should fall into place. But I don't want anybody to think this was some sort of backdoor effort to change the regulations. We were merely trying to clarify by unifying the language at the beginning and in the middle.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Wilk. Any further committee comments before we look at F? All right. Any committee comments on the edits to section F? I knew the relative income of both households was going to come back to us. I knew at some point there would need to be clarification on it. Whether this is it or not, I'm not sure, but it's interesting because that complaint that I told you guys about earlier in the meeting about the court taking 1/2 of the community income from the spouse and imputing that, it's that, or this one saying the amount by which the new spouse contributes to the obligor. I guess you could take the full income under that language versus the community property angle, right? I could see how you could get to an unfair conclusion that direction also. And I don't know which way is fair. I don't know. I think part of it was we wanted the judges to use their discretion, really figure it out. Because in every case, in every situation, it's going to be different. And we were afraid to say 50% of the community income. That's so definitive and not necessarily fitting the facts of the case, or saying the full amount contributed. What is that amount? I mean, that's up for debate. But perhaps that's what we need to say. I don't know. Committee comments?
Judge Hoskin, for the record, the concern I have with the first inclusion is that it perceptively limits what I can consider in both households, because we're only talking about the obligor, where I believe I had the ability to include the amount by which the new spouse or covenant contributes an obligor under the old language, and I have, but then we've eliminated now, well, it doesn't say obligee, so you can't consider the new spouse of the obligee and how much they contribute as part of that analysis. So it's, if we're going to limit discretion, I don't want to argue against that, but I just want to understand that that is what that sentence will do, is limit the court's ability to consider everything that it could have considered before, because we're now creating a list. And if it's not included in the list, then it's presumed that it's not included, and that was the intent. So that's my comment.
This is Bridget Robin. Just to amplify what Judge Hoskin just said, this is the circumstance where I see the relative income of both parties really come into play. And many times it is the parent who has primary custody will have remarried, and there is a highly moneyed new spouse. And so that household has a great amount of income, and the obligated parent has a much lower income. And so there is discomfort in ordering child support from a household that may be making minimum wage to a household that has far more resources available. And the way this is currently structured, I agree with Judge Hoskin, that would limit my ability to do anything in that circumstance with regard to that child support.
That scenario you just noted is the exact scenario and the reasoning behind the language. Whether it's getting abused or not, I guess the reason I knew this come back to us is because I didn't know if we had picked the right language. We sure struggled over the language of the other party. We did, and we chose it intentionally. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't LCB. It was us. We decided on those words. The relative income of both households, that's where it was cut off when we visited statutes from other states. They had only that language, and we knew that was going to maybe get us in trouble, and we needed a little more definitive language in there. All right, additional committee comments. I want to discuss section F now. So they changed ability to pay to ability to actually pay. I don't know, I'm trying to match us to the federal rules, and if those have to be contemplated, they have to be considered the way we had to consider them. I don't think ability to pay and switching it to ability to actually pay, what the heck does that do for a judge? What additional guidance is that giving somebody? It's redundant and seems silly to me. And it's outside of the norms of the statutory structure from the feds and the guidance and the audit and other states. So I don't know the addition of that word and the benefit of it, but in light of that obligor's other necessary expenses, that quote I gave you earlier, that comes a little bit in line with the federal language. That doesn't bother me as much. Go ahead, who was going to speak?
This is Joe Sanford for the record. My understanding from Mr. Willick was that the concern was it was being used as a deviation factor to deviate up. And maybe I don't have a whole lot of heartburn with the language itself. I think maybe the actually is unnecessary. Maybe this could be better addressed by changing ability to inability, because that actually is fairly similar with the federal regulations that we received. So if it was the obligor's inability to pay, I think that would give guidance to the judges that we're considering your inability to pay, not your ability to pay more. And so that
I agree
maybe
with that.
would
Yeah.
reduce some of the confusion and keep us in line. But I know inability to pay is also used in the federal stuff. It's not, I guess, maybe as clean as ability to pay, but that's just my suggestion.
Okay. Judge Hoskin, you were shaking your head. Do you have a comment?
Yeah, I'm trying to run it through possible unintended consequences. In my mind, the obligor's ability to pay is for me to consider whether they're able to pay. So I don't understand why we would need it to be inability if they don't have an ability. That's what I'm supposed to consider. Is the concern that that's not how it's not being read the way that or it's being read that they're able to pay more.
So they're they're adjusting up because they have an ability to pay more, which was not the intent.
No. And I guess that's why I'm and the confusion face was I would have never considered it the other way. But given how many times Mr. Willick has indicated that the district court is doing some crazy stuff, it makes me wonder what my colleagues are doing. So.
Well, welcome to the club, Judge. We all tend to wonder sometimes. What's interesting is that I had in mind from the start that ability to pay included an upward deviation where a court felt it was appropriate. And I suspect that comes from the testimony in the various child support bills that we heard in the legislature prior to this bill, or the bill that created this committee. Because there were several attempts when I was in the legislature to address child support. And one of the consistent things that we heard was that people, a segment of the population felt that the child support guidelines created a number that was too small. And so when you have that, high income earner who could certainly contribute more, there may be an argument to be had for increasing it if they are a high income earner and they're not contributing as much as maybe, it creates that inequality between households that people were trying to avoid. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily an appropriate way to use it, but I know that some segment of the witnesses that testified about those bills were saying that that is an appropriate thing to do. So I had in my mind that if a court felt that it was appropriate, that we had a high income earner and, we wanted to avoid the alienating effect of, creating a household that is so much nicer than the other household, maybe it was justified. But I see you shaking your head. And so I find that interesting.
I think that was contemplated under the relative income of both households. That is where that's contemplated. Ability to pay came 100% out of the federal requirement that we have right-sized orders and that somebody who can't pay it will not pay it, will never collect it, and will have ongoing child support arrears that are unfair because an inappropriate order was put on them. That's where that is the ability to pay language. That is 100% of that guidance from the federal rules about don't put in orders that can't be collected on and no one can pay. It's unfair.
Right.
And so, but I
completely agree.
think your argument was under F. I mean, yes, we had those considerations, but under F.
Sure. And I don't disagree at all. But I guess what I'm saying is I was viewing H as more of a general catch-all than just the limitation on an inability to pay, to Mr. Sanford's point. I don't disagree at all. I just had thought that it was a broader perspective than purely an inability to pay. But I'm probably the only one in the room that thought that.
Well, the one thing I noticed different in the federal language is it always mentions evidence of ability to pay. But that doesn't fix a judge using ability to pay to say you've got the ability to pay tons more money. That wasn't the intent of that section. So we're upping it, right? It was regarding their expenses, duties to care for others, all the other things, that really are in there anyways, but I don't mind the inability, the use of the word inability. I think it fixes that problem, but is it other committee comments on that?
Do we want, Judge Hoskin, do we want to limit the court's ability to make a determination that the best interest of the child are served by an obligor paying more because they have those resources? Do we want to limit that discretion?
But how would that not fall under F? They have resources, the relative income of that household is greater. It's still, it's not limited if you still have F, right?
No, I would
But-
have to agree.
Yeah,
Now, H, the problem I actually have with H is the additional add-on at the end.
Yeah.
Again, we're adding language and limiting what I can consider with regard to ability or even inability. I think you leave the period after pay.
do you foresee unintended consequences was just saying the obligor's inability to pay? I don't like the word actually, I'm leaving it out.
No, and that's what I'm saying. I do see unintended consequences if we say the obligor's inability to pay the guidelines of the guideline obligation in light of that obligor's other necessary expenses, because that limits what I
Yeah,
can
court
consider
orders
inability.
or,
Yeah.
yeah, other things going on in their life, right, that we're not considering. Other committee comments on that proposed language?
Karen, this is, oh, I'm sorry, Karen, Kim.
We're
is
getting
Karen.
tired, we're getting to this.
I like what you suggested, removing the word actually, and also Mr. Sanford's suggestion. I think that'll work for our program, or at least our county.
All right, anybody willing to make a motion for that?
Madam Chairman, I'll make a motion that we modify section H to state the obligor's inability to pay, period.
Okay,
Second,
second
Uh,
from Judge
Bridget
Rob.
Rob.
And any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor state aye.
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 Any- Any opposed? Any in abstention? Motion passes. What time is it? 11:50. Mr. Wilk, I will leave it to you. Do you think we can cover the reorganization language in the next 10 minutes?
I do.
Okay, then I will, let me take public comment first on this really quick. Ms. Tomlinson, if you'll please take public comment on agenda item number 14, Exhibit 11.
To give public comment, please raise your hand in the Zoom meeting or press *9 on your phone to take your place in the queue. I'm showing no hands are raised at this time.
All right, thank you. We'll move on to agenda item number 15, discussion and recommendations on AAML, recommended changes for reorganizing NAC Chapter 425. This would be your exhibits 12 and 13. 12 is they gave us a summary of proposed reordering, and 13 was the full document, had the edits we were talking about and all the other exhibits, but also the reorganizing of the statutes. Mr. Willick?
Very briefly, if Senator Pickard's view is correct in terms of what the committee was trying to accomplish, then this summary will not be correct because it presupposes that the purpose was to come up with a guideline schedule amount and then do adjustments to that amount and then consider the other two subjects. If that is not the intention, then obviously you shouldn't use this exact order. You need to put things in the order in which they're intended to actually be done. This was our guess based on the existing language of what was actually being intended. If the political choice is made to do something different, then obviously the structural choice should likewise be different. I can volunteer that if further input from the Academy is desired, once the statement of purpose and the suggested intention is clarified, we'd be very happy to, resubmit as requested. Some of this feeds back to the discussion we were having just a moment ago. The reason the F was so heavily modified to be talking about obligors is because the structure of the regulations talked about the obligation of an obligor. And I understand Judge Hoskin wants to talk about contributions being made to an obligee, but it alters what it is that is being calculated. We were trying to follow the presumed intent by the structure of the regulations. And if 425, 140 talks about the obligations of an obligor, then a modification of it should likewise speak to the obligation of an obligor, not to some other consideration just sort of being thrown in sideways. So again, it may just be a matter of clarification of intention. And then if there is a request for any further technical assistance, we'll be happy to suggest specific language to carry that intention into effect, given the input we've had about real world problems in real world courtrooms.
Okay, thank you. Committee comments or questions? All right, hearing none.
Just so I understand, so we're going to hold off on this until we get further down the road. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, I think we're utilizing the input and the suggested possible reorganization from Aaml. Mr. Sanford is going to work on it, although I am going to ask the committee, somebody else needs to work on it with him, please. Volunteer, Mr. Fleeman.
Let me unmute.
I saw your hand, and he wasn't involved in the first reiteration, so it may be very helpful for his insight, quite honestly, that those fresh eyes that aren't drowning in the prior information. So perfect. And Ms. Chappell, did you say something? Did you?
No, what I was thinking was I didn't know whether you might want staff to help or not, because they're not a part of the committee. And but I think this may be something you're wanting to have be more conceptual and introduced by people who don't do this work every day in terms of running the state child support enforcement program.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, we'll have the committee members do it, propose it, and then of course your staff will be putting their eyes on it, and through your eyes we'll get your input on it too. All right, thank you, Mr. Fleeman, for volunteering. I super appreciate it. I'm sure Mr. Sanford does too. We always end up relying so heavily on Mr. Sanford. I just adore how much effort you put into this. It's wonderful. Okay, so with that, I need to run public comment on agenda item number 15, please, Ms. Tomlinson.
To give public comment, please raise your hand in the Zoom meeting or press star 9 on your phone to take your place in the queue. I'm showing no hands are raised at this time.
All right, it is now 11:56. I am going to hold over for our next agenda items number 16 through 19, and not hold them today. I don't think anybody's going to complain. We've had a lot. We will move on to agenda item number 20, discuss and approve ideas for future agenda items and the next meeting date and time. Any suggestions beyond, of course, looking at the ones we just skipped? Okay, and some of you have some duties where you said you would do some work on some of those items we've skipped, so make sure you get those items to me. Of course, I've got to work with LCB and DWSS staff each time I pick a date, and then things get changed. But the main reason we changed today was so that Mr. Willett could be with us. And I appreciate everybody being flexible on that change in date. Is everybody okay with me just setting a meeting out for a couple of weeks out?
Yes.
Okay. If Ms. Tomlinson sends those out, and it's very helpful if you let her know if it's a good date, just because we can then judge if it looks like we're nowhere near quorum, I'll pick another date and try again. Okay. So if you could be responsive to her on that, we are good to go on agenda item number 20, we are going to move on to public comment. This is general public comment. Ms. Tomlinson, if you could please take it. Everyone, please note that you are limited to 2 minutes per person.
To give public comment, please raise your hand in the Zoom meeting or press star 9 on your phone to take your place in the queue. I'm showing no hands are raised at this time.
Okay, excellent. Again, Mr. Willick, we appreciate your time and energy. I know it was a lot of work, kind of like being on appeal right now and having us just bombard you with questions. But we appreciate the efforts of AML and their contributions. And we're not dismissing all the things that we didn't approve today, but we are going to utilize them in our moving forward and figuring out exactly how we're going to do it. And we appreciate it. And we did make some motions and some approvals today. With that, I'm going to adjourn the meeting and I appreciate everybody's time today. Thank you.
Thank you. You all too.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.